So, hello. Is everybody in? Take a seat. Okay, good. This is okay. So, I'm still here, and you'll still have to listen to me. So, if you were in my talk, like, who wasn't at the first talk? Okay, cool. So I won't take it for granted that you know what I was talking about. But I was talking about organizations and how organizations have to come together to make the best use of their tools. And a very frustrating part of the talk was that I just wanted to show you cool stuff to do with those tools. But because the focus was on organizations, I only had time to show you one cool thing. So this talk will be more about what you can do with those tools and how you have to customize those tools. And I call it the engagement paradox for one reason. We're trying to measure what people are doing on these websites and how they're using our apps without actually having the privilege of asking them. It would be very weird if you clicked a link on a website and then a pop-up comes up and says, hey, where are you going? Why are you going? What's your name? How old are you? What's your gender? That would be really weird. I bet some sites actually do that, but we can't ask our visitors, so we have to use quantifiable data. We have to use quantitative data to know what they're doing, right? That's what GA is, that's what Yandex is. We're looking at numbers and inferring intention from those numbers. And this is the paradox. How do we measure something, but that by definition happens here? My engagement with a website happens here, not with my clicking or my site. I can open a web page, but I'm not looking at it. I'm thinking about something else. I'm not engaging with that page. So that's the paradox. And now we'll try to figure out how we approach this paradox.
I'm sorry, Simo. Could you please put your mic?
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Whoa.
Whoa. Yeah.
That was cool.
It works like that.
Okay. Now everybody can hear? Everybody can hear me now? Good. Okay. So I'll just have to. Okay. Sure. So I work at a company called 8-Bit Sheep. My job is to, I said this, I'll tell you a different story this time. So my job is to talk about in conferences, talk about organizations and how you can patch things up with your data tools. That's a really nice part of my job. I try to avoid doing any analytics for a living. I think it's a really boring job to have, in a way. So I try to keep it as a hobby, and it's worked very nicely. No, just kidding. So, oh, here we go. So, what we're doing is really easy in a way, but the pesky data just comes back all the time and reminds us that this is very difficult. And this is what engagement is. We're analyzing data, but in a way, the more data we have, the more difficult it gets. Every single piece of data that we get into the engagement puzzle, like everything we analyze from our visitors, makes it more and more complicated to understand what the reality is. And I'll just show you an example. Like I think everybody who's been working with GA or working with web analytics data has some point had to struggle with bounce rate. As a KPI, you know, we have to get our bounce rate down because it's such a fundamental thing and so on. And the other thing you might have had to work about is like session duration, how long the users are on the site, right? So bounce rate and session durations are, for any content publisher, very easy ways to get started with engagement tracking. But when you think about it, when you think about how Google calculates bounce rates and session duration, you might have to rethink this approach. When we talk about engagement, that bounce rate essentially tries to measure, because a high bounce rate means low engagement, right? That's the promise. This is a bunch of things that goes around in my head when I think about engagement on a new site or a new app that I visit. And it all starts with visibility. Now, web analytics tools like Google Analytics don't care anything about visibility. They don't care if the user actually saw the page, right? The page view hit is sent when the page was loaded. There's no indication anywhere if my eyes ever engaged with the content. There's nothing. So the very first thing where we already break things down is, are we collecting page views from users who never viewed the page? Is the whole thing a big lie? So we can measure that. We can send information to GA saying, This page was visible, this page view was from a visible page, and this page view was from a tab or from an invisible or a hidden page. And we can qualify our data based on that. We can qualify it to, instead of saying 100,000 times this article was viewed, we can say 25,000 of the times the article was actually open in the browser and viewable, and 75,000 times there was no way the user actually could have viewed the article because it was hidden in a browser tab or minimized in the window. So visibility is the first thing in engagement. Are we measuring this? Are you capturing the fact that there is content that is not visible, and are you posing it as visible content? Think about that. And then there's all these interactions. Are you measuring what people are doing on the site? People click, they scroll, they press buttons on the keyboard, they long press things, and that's different from a short press on an iPad, for example. They drag things around. On Dropbox, you can drag and drop stuff, you know. They resize the content window, they highlight words, they copy text to the clipboard. There are all these little signals. Some of them you feel are really insignificant, like who cares about highlighting text? Well, I do. That's my way of doodling. You remember in the days of the good old analog telephones with the cords, and you were like twisting the cord in your finger while talking? Then you had a notepad next to the phone where you just doodled while you were talking on the phone. That's my way of doodling on the web. I highlight text. And the website doesn't necessarily know this, but I'm giving them a very strong signal that I am engaged with the content. When I am highlighting text on a page, I am engaged with that content. I'm reading it. If you don't measure that little bit of information, you will never have access to this little insight. Copying to the clipboard is one of the, I can't really think of a more profound way to establish that you are engaging with the content. You're copying stuff to the clipboard. You can measure this in your analytics tools, but are you doing so? Then there's the idea of time. In a very Einsteinian sense, time is very relative, and data quality of time is even more relative. Google Analytics by default measures time spent on a page as the delta between two page views. So when a page view happened and when a second page view happens, that's the time that was spent on the first page. So now imagine this very rare situation. You open up 3 articles in browser tabs. What happens? 3 page views are sent, and each one stops the timer from the previous page. So you get 3 or 4 page views, and the time on page for each is less than a second. But as a human being, you then open that tab and you look at it for 30 minutes and read every single word. But GA will report it as 0 seconds of interaction, because that's the time it took for the next browser tab to open. So we have to understand this complexity, and we have to tell our analytics tool that, hey, that's a really, really crap measurement of time. That's bad data quality right there. We have to tell GA that, hey, use this instead. And I'll show you what I use actually, but use this measurement instead. Forget your broken model and customize it. And then there are these goals that are more difficult, but they are very powerful engagement measurements. Are people subscribing to the blog? Are they liking things? Are they printing things? Like, who prints stuff these days when rainforests are being chopped down? Well, many people do. I was so scared about customs entering this country that I printed out every single document and every single email I had with Yandex about my invitation, because I didn't want to become unprepared. Totally ridiculous thing to do, but I was engaging. And customs went really, really well, by the way. Thanks for asking. I think they'll let me out of the country far easier than letting me in, so I'm not worried anymore. And then there are the long-term goals that good engagement brings. A good engagement increases the number of your followers, increases the revenue per user, increases recruitment efforts, better rankings in search engines. You're trying to measure engagement so that you can improve engagement. And you don't get to these long-term goals until you've figured out what you're actually supposed to measure. And then there's this like really difficult stuff. This is like the most difficult part of being a quantifiable analyst, measuring numbers, is what about all this qualitative stuff? Session replays like Yandex gives us, heat maps, polls, feedback? What about online buzz, social media buzz? It's very difficult to draw parallels between that data and the stuff that you're measuring in your analytics tools, but it's doable. And you have to be able to do that to get the whole picture. And so when you look at this matrix of different levels and different things, and all of these little things here unravel one additional part of the engagement set up on your website. When you look at this complexity, all these things that you should and could be measuring, do you think these two metrics give you a good picture of what's going on? Session duration and bounce rate. I don't think so. There's a time and place for these two metrics, but they are not engagement KPIs. They're not. Engagement is a product of so many different things that happens on the site. It's a combination of so many different metrics that's collected on the site. And it's a combination of understanding how you expect your visitors to engage with your site and how they are actually engaging with the site. It's a combination of all this. And trying to stuff it all down into two metrics, it's offensive. It's offensive that GA tries to do this for us. So we need to break through this. We need to stop doing that and start looking at engagement as this big mystery blob that we're adding fundamental stuff to, so that at some point it's no longer a mystery and it's no longer a blob, but it's something more fundamental. So let's see how we do this. And the first thing we have to do as responsible people who have a budget is to why should we customize? These tools are great. Google can't make any errors. They're a multi-billion-dollar company. Yandex can't make any errors. They can't make mistakes. Their tools have to be perfect. They wouldn't give us bounce rate if they didn't believe it to be a good metric. So this is and hey, I'm giving Google a hard time because I've been using their tool for years and years and years, and I'm allowed to be a little grumpy about some of the things that it does. I'm very happy with it in general. I'm a happy user of GA, but I am allowed to be frustrated by some of the inconsistencies. So this is a typical dashboard in Google Analytics. You have your page views. We already discussed the problem with page views, right? They might not be actual page views at all. Bounce rate and conversion rate. Don't get me started on conversion rate. It's almost as bad as bounce rate as a KPI. And then we have this mystery thing called a session. A session is the fundamental building block of Google Analytics. Almost everything in GA, every single important metric revolves around the session. And when you think about it, what does a session reflect? What does it describe? It describes your interaction with the website, right? If you had 5 sessions during the day, you had 5 meaningful interactions with the website, each one consisting of different hits and different interactions. So that's the key to the algorithm. But then when you open that concept up, this is what a Google Analytics session is. This is the algorithm as far as we know it. There are these really weird things there, like the fact that it expires after 30 minutes of inactivity. Who decided that? Why 30 minutes? Is that like the typical attention span of a human being? Why 30 minutes? Why not 29? Why not 45? Why not 2 hours? Why is 30 minutes the default session timeout that not many people actually ever change? What about this? This one, my favorite of all time, midnight. It's so funny. When you think about it, if you have a store and you have a 24/7 store, so it's open all night, and then you have a visitor come in at 5 minutes to midnight and they're looking at the shelves and they're shopping around and viewing stuff, and then it comes midnight and you have to throw them out of the store and tell them, okay, come right back in so that I can reset your session. That's what GA does with your data. It throws all the users out of their current session and then brings them back in the second they send the next hit. So if you have a global site that has multiple time zones, it's possible that you're collecting a different set of data in each of the profiles with a different time zone configured. because the same user in each of these time zones might have a completely different number of sessions simply because they happen to visit the site at the midnight of one of those time zones. So it's weird. That's what I'm trying to say. It's really weird. And there's all these other stuff like referral exclusions and campaign changes and cross-domain tracking and so on. But all of these things are like totally artificial. All of the things highlighted in red are things that you can actually impact. You can tweak every one of those. So you can take the concept of a session, twist it around, play around with it, and fix it. You can tell GA exactly, this is what my ideal session is. It's not the perfect approach because a session should differ from one person to the next and from 1 hour to the next. There's always a different intent. But here's the kicker. Let's say you've been collecting all this data for years using this default configuration of a session. And when you go to the boardroom and explain that, hey, our conversion rate went up or our bounce rate went down or we get so and so many more page views, how much do you consider this algorithm in your mind when you're talking about sessions and explaining things to your boss? Like, okay, so I think about it a lot because I'm obsessed that way. But it's possible that so many business decisions around the world are made without understanding what the metric is that they're talking about. If you talk about conversion rate, you're talking about a ratio of conversions to sessions, not users, but to sessions. And if you're telling your boss that, hey, we have a 2.41 conversion rate, what is that? What are you actually saying? Because how GA collects its data, it's inflexible. The data ends up in the data tables. It always uses whatever definition of a session is currently being used. And this is apparent. Look at this report. It's one of the most typical reports in GA. You have sessions, bounce rate, pages per session, average session duration, e-commerce conversion rate. Each one of these metrics is bound to the concept of a session. The session is the underlying metric in each of these. So now if you go back to the algorithm and you change the campaign timeout, the session timeout from 30 minutes to 25 minutes, or you change the time zone so that midnight changes place, that sounds weird, but it does happen, or you add a new campaign source or a referral exclusion, every single one of these metrics will change as a result of this tweak. Your conversion rate can actually go up without you actually generating a single piece of revenue extra. Only by tweaking this metric did you make that happen. That's how incredibly fragile the relationship between this arbitrary measurement of a session is to all this data that we use to make business decisions with. So that's why I find it absolutely fundamental in all my talks and in all my trainings is to start with these concepts and explain how fragile it is and how often it happens that somebody starts celebrating something like a decrease in bounce rate only to have it shown to them that it actually wasn't a business impact, but somebody accidentally changed something in Google Analytics settings. That's why the bounce rate went down. Or they accidentally sent more than one page view in the session. So this is the downside of customization. We tend to do things more and more, and the more we customize, the less we can actually say what was a real business result in our data and what was just a result of this tweaking. So this concept of a session is fundamental. It's absolutely in the core of everything GA does. It's something I wish that they would get rid of, to be honest. Firebase is already getting there. It's a hit stream-based system. We have tools like Snowplow where you can actually define the concept of a session yourself. But GA is still operating on this manner. And I think my takeaway for you is that the next time somebody around you says, hey, I think we need more sessions. I think we need the session metric to go up. Please question this thing. Ask what they are actually hoping for. Do they want more revenue, more users, something, but not sessions? It doesn't make sense. It's a broken metric in the way that you can open a site, browse a page, and then go and walk your dog for 35 minutes. And then you come back to the site and you do something and a new session starts because the 30 minutes was up. but you still have the same intent. You still have the same thing in mind that you had when you started browsing the site. They should be part of the same session, but they're not, simply because this algorithm says they're not. So this is the dishonesty of data at its heart. And as responsible analysts, our job is to understand this thing. We don't have to do anything about it. We just have to be able to show data or a report and say that it's very possible that this data is corrupted because of these flaws in the sessionization algorithm. Anyway, that's my rant. Now for the fun stuff. So now we've understood that we need to customize things and we need to measure engagement and we need to understand how these metrics are flawed and how we can improve them. So how do we do that? What we want to end up is with some proper dashboard, not the one with page views and bounce rates and sessions. We want our dashboards as we want our reports. We want them to tell our organization how our organization is doing, how my company is doing, how 8-Bit Sheep, which is my company, I want Google to tell me, hey Simo, your company is doing pretty nicely. This week you had so much more this, and I know it's very important to you. I want the data to tell me that. A baseline installation of GA gives you page views and nothing else. That's absolutely useless to any company. You have to measure events. You have to customize so that you end up with a dashboard like this. This is using Clipfolio, which is a very nice and inexpensive dashboarding tool, lightweight BI tool in a way. My blog, I wanted to tell me what the scroll rate and read rate of my articles was. Scroll rate means how many users scroll past 1/3 of each article. Read rate means they reach the end of the article and they spend a certain amount of time on the article. I want to know that because that's important to me. There is no metric called scroll rate in GA. There's no metric called read rate in GA. Those are calculating metrics I've had to do by myself in this dashboard because I need GA data to be significant for me. I want to know how long the users stayed on the site before hitting the back button and going back to the search engine results page. If I see a correlation between lots of hits from Google search, but very, very short time on those pages, I should be concerned because people are clicking results, but they're not satisfied with what they see. That's my search engine optimization wisdom right there in a nutshell. That's about how much I know about it these days. I want to know how my articles are performing, not just how many page views they got, but also how long the user actually engaged with the article. So there's this, it's totally unclear from that, but there's a metric called average engagement time, and I will show you in a bit how to build that. And I want to know the full funnel. How many times an article was opened, how many times it was scrolled past 1/3, how many times it was read. So this is my goal when I work with data. I take a tool like Google Analytics that is totally agnostic to my problems. It doesn't care about them, and I make it care about them. I tell Google Analytics, hey, these are my problems. Now you'll have to deal with them. And it's a tough discussion to have. Lots of drinking involved, lots of commiserating. But I need Google Analytics to understand that my company and my needs and my organization is totally unique, and the default metrics are simply not enough. So how do we do this? Well, I have these totally out of my own head, fabricated complexity scale. So if something is complex to implement, meaning it has lots of code or lots of different tags or understanding of the website, the complexity scale goes up. And the metric impact is, in my experience, how big a deal it is to this engagement idea. So the first one, and you'll get the slides, so you'll have all those links, so you don't have to write anything down. First thing in any content site and almost any website in the world is to measure the relevant clicks. Click is a very, very powerful thing. First of all, a click can't happen if the user isn't viewing the page. It's impossible to click a page that isn't currently in the viewport. So a click is always qualified. The user is viewing the page, and they're interested enough about something to follow a link, or click a button, or click an image, or click a slider. If it's an outbound link, that's really important to measure because, hey, they're leaving your site. At least have the courtesy of telling you where they're going, right? So we use outbound link measurement, for example, to know what are the exit points of our site. Where are people clicking to? What are they downloading? This is a powerful source of engagement information because they are actually leaving your site, which is a big thing. There's lots of browser events you can download. We talk about clicks and scrolls, but man, are there many more. You can measure when the mouse is moving. You can measure when the user enters a form field, so actually activates a form field. You can measure when they type into the form field. You can measure when they change the content of a form field and move to the next one. You can measure when they copy to the clipboard, like I already mentioned. You can measure when they select text. And this is just a handful of the APIs. You can measure when they are about to leave the page. Before unload is a very, very cool listener, because you can fire an event when the user is about to, they have already clicked a link or they've already closed the browser. It sends an event to GA. And you can do all sorts of stuff with this, like measure real time with it. Scroll depth, for anybody working with content, this is like, I think this is like a given these days. We need to know how deep they're scrolling down the content, right? If we only measure a page view of an article, it doesn't really tell us anything. Are they actually reading the article? And we can build a report of how deep people are scrolling those pages. Visibility is another interesting thing. It goes beyond scrolling in that you can actually define how many times did the user actually see my mailing list subscription link, regardless of where it is on the page. So you can fire a tag into GA or analytics tools that says, a user just saw your mailing list subscription form, which is a cool way of knowing that they're engaged with the content. You can combine things. Tracking scroll depth and time spent is a really cool way to make bounce rate actually useful. So when the user has scrolled a certain amount and they've spent a certain amount of time, that's when you fire your debounce event. So you fire an interactive event so that it kills the bounce for that session. Many people only do the timer, so 30 seconds after page load, fire an event so that it destroys the bounce. That's a common thing to do. It's called, I've heard the term before. It's called bounce rate optimization, or adjusted bounce rate. Oh God, time for a little rant, my friends. If you're thinking of adjusting bounce rate or bounce rate optimization, just don't do it. It's a silly thing to do. You're taking a metric and you're tweaking that metric rather than you're tweaking the content so that it produces a better metric. It's such a silly thing to do. So many people are worried about the metrics that they forget that there's a business process producing those metrics. You've all heard of conversion rate optimization, where we try to improve the ratio of conversions on our site. And my secret to conversion rate optimization is to set a goal on your website that matches every single page on the site, so you'll have a 100% conversion rate. That's how you optimize conversion rate. It's so easy. So that's the fallacy. That's the problem of metric optimization. There's a cool website called whatisagoodbouncerate.com that will help you understand the beauty of bounce rate. Back to the subject. So this is like getting more and more important these days, but we can't just do web analytics, right? It's an unsustainable model of analytics because people use apps, they use tools that are not available in GA. So we need tools like heat maps and session replays. These are from Yandex, but there are also tools like Hotjar. They help us understand the big picture. They help us understand, look beyond the numbers and see what actual human beings are doing on the site. And for a person working with GA, this is something you often forget. The numbers you see are produced by actual human beings and a bunch of bots. But you can try to exclude those bots somehow. But human beings are doing a lot of that stuff you see on the website. So much of our work is to understand what goes on in those people's minds. And these tools help you with that. Then there's this thing called browsing behavior. So you can actually track how many times a tab was opened on your site. How many tabs did the user have open while they're browsing your site? How many times was a page view the result of a reload or a back or a forward button of the browser? This is actually pretty cool stuff, because for a content publisher, I'm always wondering, are people reading my content, or are they just abstractly opening tabs and never doing anything with them? It's totally doable with JavaScript. SERP bounce time I think I mentioned, maybe I didn't, but you can actually measure how long the user is on the site before they skip back to the search engine results page. A fundamental thing to measure if you're working with search engine optimization. Totally doable again. And it gives you a report like this, basically, where you have your landing pages from Google search. You have how many times they were landing pages, and then you have how long the user, by average, stayed on that page before going back to the SERP results. And you see that there are some problems down there, like the number 6 iframe cross-domain tracking in Google Tag Manager has only a 1.5 minute bounce time when the average is 5 minutes. So I'm a bit worried about those top results. People are bouncing back quite fast. Well, typically, if you have lots of organic results, it's much more common to have a short bounce time because, you know, quantity invites people who weren't necessarily looking for your information at all, but it's an optimization place for you. And then we have this thing called engagement time. So how long people, this is how we fix Google's page view metric or time on page metric. We actually measure how long they are engaged with the content. So the way it works is that when the user moves their mouse around, clicks, scrolls, presses keys on the keyboard, we start a timer. And as soon as the user has spent 5 seconds without doing any of those things, so hands up, we stop the timer. So we get a cumulative time of all the time the user has actually been engaged with the content, moving their mouse around, scrolling, clicking, and we ignore all the idle time. And this is what we get. Oh man, it's such a bad font color choice. Sorry about that. But by average, it's around, Google Analytics reports by average 5 times more time on page than what the engagement time is. So Google Analytics is reporting a 5-fold difference there. So people are 5 times less engaged compared to how much Google Analytics is reporting them to be on the page. So this excludes all those visits that just open browser tabs. The engagement time requires that you are actively viewing the page and moving your mouse around and clicking. So this is, for me, this is a really important thing to understand, not only because it's a cool metric to have, but also because it so clearly highlights the flaw in Google Analytics' time on page metric. Time on page doesn't measure anything. It measures the time between 2 page views. But page views are completely artificial things. They are page loads, not views. I want to know how long the users are actually viewing the content so that I can use that as my baseline for time. And then there's this idea of content as e-commerce. And for a long time, this has been my favorite thing to do with content and with engagement, because it really accumulates all these different things: engagement, clicks, scrolls, time on site. It accumulates them all into one set of reports. And all of these tips before, they're all like widely available to any analytics tool. It's just JavaScript. I'm using Google Analytics as an example because it's my tool of choice. This last tip is at the moment solely for Google Analytics, but I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to build that with any analytics tool. You'll just have to use a bit more customization. But what you get is this report, the enhanced e-commerce report, that tells you your shopping activity. How many times were things added to cart, how many checkouts, and how many purchases. But now, because you're not measuring products, you're measuring content, what you get: how many times was an article opened? How many sessions had a scroll event? How many sessions of those scrolled past 1/3? And how many ended up reading? So this funnel starts telling me how my content is faring on the big scale. I have a pretty big jump between the 1/3 and the red. So people are skimming the beginning of the article, but they're not spending enough time on the article. So I want to optimize against that gap. Otherwise, it looks pretty nice. And this is cool. Your products being your content, so variable guide, track, for those are articles on my site. Product revenue is the number of words read in those articles. So I send the length of the article in words as the revenue of that article. So what does this give me? Well, it gives me the nerdiest vanity metric for a publisher. 44 million words were read on my blog last month. That's, for me, it's such a cool way to go into a bar and boast about my success. No, I don't. It's lame, but it's still a metric that you can use. Average price becomes the average length of an article. This is for me. 1,800 words is the average length of an article that I've written. And then we have these two. Scroll to open. So what is the ratio of articles being opened and users scrolling past 1/3? Starting to scroll on the article. So the average is 82%. So 20% of time when an article is open, the user doesn't even scroll. They open the article and do nothing else in that session. Or maybe they leave that page and do something else. That's a big number in a way. But on the other hand, that's what bloggers have to struggle with. People opening the articles but never actually reading them. And then the byte to detail rate becomes read to open. So out of the times that the articles are opened, how many times are they actually read? So scroll to the bottom and the user spends a given amount of time. Now you know that reading is impossible to know. I don't know if you're reading my content. I've been thinking about doing this. So when you reach the end of the article, I want to do this little pop-up that asks like 5 questions about the article. And if you get them all right, then I know that you read the article. But then somebody said that that would be horrible for user experience, so I didn't do it. But reading is such a very difficult thing to know. But I use a proxy, so scroll to the bottom and spend some time on the article. That's good enough. And the time depends on the length of the article. So a long article requires 5 minutes and a short one a little bit less, so on. So, you might have seen this slide in the previous presentation, but it's totally applicable here. Why are we here? So all this stuff, we could take the easy way out and just install Google Analytics or Yandex Metrica or Firebase. Just install it and then do nothing about it, and then just look at the dashboards and the reports and think that we're doing fine. And we could do that, and many companies do that. I asked a Google engineer a while ago what their estimate is out of the hundreds of millions of websites where Google Analytics is on, how many only collect the page view and nothing else. And he said that the long tail can go over 50% of all the sites. So 50% of all the installations of GA by estimate are totally broken, useless. You don't do anything with just the page view. You have to unveil the engagement problem. You have to add stuff to the site. You have to collect these events. I'm not saying that the list of 10 events are for everyone. They're for me. They're my experiences with engagement. It wouldn't make sense to do that on a site that isn't focused on content. But the idea is that you're telling Google Analytics that, hey, this is my site, these are my problems, and I want you to tell me the right things by tweaking these metrics. So just to wrap up, engagement is more than bounce rate, and more than average session duration, and more than page views. Engagement is this whole complex mess of different things that your visitors can do on the site and beyond the site. They're engaging with you if they're so inspired by your content that they walk into your store and buy something. That's engagement. All these abstractions, the session is an abstraction, and abstractions are used to avoid complexity, right? Sessions are given to you so that you don't have to worry about grouping those hits together. But that's not how the human mind works. You see something simple and you're skeptical. It has to be more complex than that. And sessions are. The fundamental building block of Google Analytics is a very complex thing that might have nothing to do with reality, but we still use it. For a reason. There are good reasons for it, but we still use it. Measuring and customizing your analytics platform is an absolute necessity. I showed you the difference between the time metric. For me, that was a fundamental thing. I unveiled a flaw in the existing paradigm and I fixed it by giving me something more meaningful to me. So with that, running out of my voice, it is now officially over. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Simo. Если у вас есть вопросы, то у нас есть время буквально на один.
Boom. Андрей, Level Travel. У меня такой вопрос. Вот рассказывалось про то, что сессия считается там 30 минут, почему не 40 минут. Как бы я для себя принял концепцию такую, что неважно, как считается метрика, важно, чтобы она не менялась с течением времени, и чтобы я мог сравнивать периоды разные. Но она будет таким индикатором. Почему именно вот Simo, интересно, столько внимания уделяет, чтобы как считается метрика? Ну, вот, например, общепризнанные сессии.
So the question is that you give a lot of attention to the metrics and to how does it calculated. like the time of session. And how is your name? Как вас зовут? And Andrei asks, I'm sorry, and Andrei asks about, it doesn't matter actually how do you calculate this metric, but if you're thinking that it is not changed in time, that you just can stuck with it and use this metric as some kind of background. So why do you think that it is important to count how metric is calculated?
Oh, so did I understand correctly that there's a worry that if you constantly change stuff, it becomes like the comparison with history breaks or something like that? So maybe. Well, I can answer that. Maybe I missed maybe somebody can fill me in if I missed the point. But if I understood correctly, there's a danger with, well, maybe you can specify. Like, is the problem that some metrics change, and you'd actually need them to stay the same so that the historical comparison is okay? Okay, maybe I missed it. Okay.
Вы имеете в виду, что метрики меняются или? It doesn't matter how metrics calculated. It matters how it changed in time. How the dynamics of this metrics changed in time.
Oh, okay. So let me try again. so it's more relevant to see the trend, maybe? Okay, yeah. Well, that's a good point. It is a good point, but I think it's the ultimate cop-out. I think it's the ultimate, it's the ultimate reason not to do anything. To say that as long as the rates are okay and we see the trends, it doesn't matter if the underlying data is flawed, because that's true. It's okay to work with a broken idea of a session, and as long as the idea of the conversion is also broken. So they're equally broken, so the trend stays the same. And by the way, hey, in this day's web analytics, that's totally fine because the data we use is very flawed. People use ad blockers. They use Safari and Firefox, which block our traffic. So there is an underlying assumption that the data is flawed. But the place where and that works with some metrics, but you can't generalize that across your entire data set. Engagement is so fragile to these little fluctuations in how you are measuring your site, and we can see it that bounce rate can be completely devastated by a simple mistake you make in your implementation. And you can see the power of your customizations on those metrics. And you have to turn it that instead of making mistakes, you're making deliberate decisions to alter that bounce rate. And the same with conversion rates. And GA gives us these rates simply because it has to do that. It has to give us those trends. But I've always thought that that's not just the way we do these things. We can't accept the fact that we're working with flawed data, even if it means that we have to reevaluate those trends. And I know that it's not a popular opinion always because it's so easy to trying to fix data quality in a system that will never have a perfect data quality is very difficult. And that's why that's why we pay so much money to Google Analytics Premium, so that we get that raw data, and we can use BigQuery instead of GA to build our own metrics. But I think that it still doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to, because otherwise we'll just be measuring page views. The minute you measure the first event, you're customizing. You're changing the concept of a bounce. You're changing the concept of a conversion. And you just have to keep on doing that until that data tells you about your site. I think one point that I think I gathered from you is that if you have a long-standing, like years of data, and it's been done well, like lots of effort into customization, there's a temptation to just leave it be because at least the trend will be reliable. But I'm not really sure that's how it works. I'm not sure that the trend is reliable. I'm not sure that the two metrics that the rate is comparing are equally flawed in the function of time. So I think that at the very least, like the minimum effort is to evaluate those metrics and see, are they still reliable? You don't have to do anything about them if the trend is reliable. You don't have to fix them. But I think you do have to evaluate them, and that's part of this whole thing. It's not just about fixing and doing things, but it's also just the same way when I showed the sessions thing. This is what a Google Analytics session is. I'm not telling you to fix it. I'm just telling you this is how it works. So understanding how it works is sometimes fundamental. But that is a very good point. And I think that one of the problems of these conference talks is that I have so little time and I have to get this has to be done everywhere, when it's not like that. You have to take little bits and pieces and try to adjust them to your own organization's idiosyncrasies. A very good question indeed, once I understood it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Simo.
Okay, that was it. Thank you very much, guys. See you later.